Hello there, and welcome to Lesson 7. This is our final lesson for the course. I just want to say that this course has been so much fun. I love poetry, so I've been very grateful and felt very blessed to be able to share that experience with you. You guys have been great. This has been a great class. I've loved reading your discussion boards. At the point I'm recording this, because I want to have the content to you early, I've only read through 2 sets of discussion board posts, but they've just been absolutely wonderful. And I know we haven't been meeting in person, but to be able to read your discussion boards and write back to you after you've heard my lectures and read the poetry, it feels like we are having a conversation. I love talking about poetry, but you all have had really interesting and wonderful things to say that have made this class a joy for me. So here we are, Lesson 7, the end of it all. We started in Lesson 6 to talk about the 20th and 21st centuries, and there were, of course, still some pivotal moments in the 20th and 21st centuries that really influenced poetry. So we're going to look at 4 of those: the Harlem Renaissance, confessional poetry, and post-colonial poetry. And I'll also have definitions for those 3 on the next slide, but also postmodern poetry. But the reason I put in contemporary poetry there is we're going right up, to the present with our last 2 poets, Mary Oliver and Derek Walcott, writing very recently. So we'll do quick definitions for these 4. There are more, but I would say the 4 biggest poetic movements of the 20th and 21st centuries: Harlem Renaissance, confessional poetry, postmodernism, and postcolonialism. And then we'll get right into, again, I can only look at about half the authors. I mean, I'm sure you'd love if I looked at all of them and the lecture were like 2 hours long, right? But I'll look at about half the writers, just ones that, I mean, they're all really interesting to talk about, all some of my favorite poets, but the ones that I've kind of done my own work with, studying and writing on them over the years, so that I have the best content to incorporate for you. And then also just the approach of, it doesn't really matter which ones I talk about, and I probably shouldn't talk about them very much, because I want to leave as much space as possible for you to write really wonderful things on the discussion boards. And you can, of course, engage with things I've said on here. You don't have to say entirely new things. But let's move through them. So the first of these chronologically would be the Harlem Renaissance, which happens in the mid 20th century, picking up after what we talked about last time with modernism in the First World War. So it was a creative and intellectual movement in which creative and intellectual life flourished in African American communities following the Great Migration. So the Great Migration was basically, after the end of slavery and Reconstruction, after some time, many African Americans were, like hundreds of thousands of them, were able to finally move out of the South to different places and move into more urban areas, more kind of densely packed together, like we talked about with modernism. And so there was just this flourishing of creative and intellectual life then, and that's why they called it the Harlem Renaissance. Um, One writer from the reading I gave you described it as a spiritual coming of age, which I think is a really good way to describe it for African American artists and thinkers who seized upon their first chances for group expression and self-determination, following the end of slavery, like I said. What they did in their writing was they explored the beauty and pain of Black life and sought to define themselves and their community outside of white stereotypes. Um, and so you really get that, like, the establishing of the African American identity through poetry, which is what is just really cool about the poems of the Harlem Renaissance. And some of them used classic forms such as the sonnet. Claude McKay did that, but others brought specifically Black cultural creations into their work. And so if you read more of the Harlem Renaissance poems, and if you just click the link on um, our website, Poetry Foundation, the website, I shouldn't say our website, but the one I've been using the most this quarter, um, there are many, many Harlem Renaissance poems there. Again, I wanted to represent as much of the 20th and 21st century as I could in one lesson, and don't want to just overload you with too much reading or reading that's beyond your capacity in a 4-week course. But so get in there, read more Harlem Renaissance poems, and it's really cool to see how they infuse the rhythms of jazz and blues into their poems. Things like Dream Boogie by Langston Hughes. And Hughes is an incredible writer. He's probably the most famous Harlem Renaissance poet, but just an amazing poet. So I've included 3 poems by him. Moving on, we have confessional poetry. This was the mid 20th century, and you really have the breaking down of the wall between poet and speaker. Sylvia Plath is probably the most famous confessional poet, but in sort of the wake of modernism, you have just this breaking down the wall between poet and speaker, where this is so clearly her talking. Like, let's not beat around the bush here. There's usually supposed to be or we're supposed to assume as readers a distinction between the poet and speaker. We can just assume with Sylvia Plath and most of the confessional poetry that that's gone. And there's an emphasis on mental health in the poets talk about their personal lives. Sylvia Plath had just a terrible, awful marriage to Ted Hughes, who in his own way, if you look purely at the work he produced, was an incredible poet, and I think the poet laureate of England for a while in the mid 20th century, but just an awful human being. And her talking openly about their really awful marriage and her poetry, but her not being the only confessional poet to do that. And lots of men and women, like Robert Lowell, who is one of the main confessional poets, talked about his marriage and his mental health struggles. And so it's really interesting where you see this, the confessional describes it the best in this breakdown between poet and speaker, but the opening up about mental health. And I think if you read Sylvia Plath's life, if you read her biography or even just her Wikipedia page, it's so tragic. It makes me cry almost each time I read it. But I think we see, if people had been able to get access to help with their mental health the way they are now, 50 years ago, 70 years ago, things may have turned out differently for Sylvia Plath. And so that's tragic. But her confessional writing and the confessional writing of the other confessional poets we have on here is, some of the best writing I've seen. One Art by Elizabeth Bishop is an example of a villanelle, which is this really interesting, highly structured poetic form. You think a sonnet, which we studied, is highly structured. The villanelle is even a more structured form. But it's a really wonderful poem. It may be probably in my top 10, maybe in my top 5 poems. One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. The most famous villanelle is Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night by Dylan Thomas, which I didn't include in the course just because everyone's read it so many times and I had to be really selective on a 4-week course. But it's good for us to see a villanelle. And then Adrienne Rich, one of the most famous feminist poets of the latter half of the 20th century. Diving Into the Wreck is this long, powerful poem by her. Just a tremendous poem. It's really interesting to think about what the wreck could be, as she describes, describes what someone diving into and exploring a wreck under the sea would be, but then all the metaphorical connotations that could possibly be there. And in some ways it's very subtle, and there's maybe more than one way to go with those interpretations. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on Hughes, Plath, Rich, and Bishop in the discussion board. Then postmodernism, as I mentioned last time, I wouldn't say there's one poet from this lesson who's quintessentially postmodern. They all kind of could fall under that descriptor in some ways. But we have to address postmodernism since it was a major part of literature in the 20th and 21st century, although now we're kind of moving beyond it. When I was in grad school, people were saying, like, we're kind of coming to the end of the postmodern period, but it had been what was popular as kind of the dominant literary movement from the latter half of the 20th century into the 2010s. And now, where are we now? Like, post-human, I think, is a good summary, but what does that look like in the literature? But if the modernists were trying to pull together the pieces of a now fragmented world in modernity, Rainer Maria Rilke with his goal for cosmic unity, um, then the postmodernists are like, hey, it's fragmented. We might as well have fun here. And they start playing with it. And so you get a lot of things that you see that you're probably more familiar with, like breaking the fourth wall. Those are very postmodern things. Let's have fun with the mess. But there's also, in a way, by embracing the fragments in that way, it is kind of a pessimistic view, even though the literature is often very fun because it's kind of saying, is this all there is? So in a way, I actually almost find a lot of hope in the modernist poets who were at least trying to put the pieces together and maybe believe they could be put together. So postmodernism can feel more playful and fun, but the question is it as optimistic? And then the last one we'll look at with our final poet, Derek Walcott, post-colonialism, which is exactly what it sounds like, literature engaging with the effects of imperialism after decolonization. So we talked quite a bit in both lessons 5 and 6 about imperialism, because lesson 5 so much engaged with the British Empire as in that Victorian backdrop. But colonialism ended. Basically, World War One and the resources, or World War II, sorry, and the resources expended there put an end to colonialism. It's still around, obviously, but the big empires, most of them fell, like the English, the French, the Portuguese. And so now you have decolonization, and it's this new life post-colonization. It could never go back to what it was before pre-colonization, but what is it like now that the imperialists have pulled out? And Derek Walcott just is probably one of the greatest poets of all time. To see what he's able to do, we'll talk more about him at the end of the lecture. So these are the 4 biggest movements, I would say, of the last 100 years, and they'll bring us up to the present. Again, we can't talk about all the poets in the lecture time-wise, so I'm going to focus on just 3, again, who have really spoken to me that I've really done some work with over the years. Seamus Heaney I want to explore here because his work really builds on what Yeats was doing, engaging with kind of the Irish condition, which is so emblematic of the modern, postmodern condition in the 20th and 21st centuries. A little bit on Heaney. He was born into a Roman Catholic family in predominantly Protestant Northern Ireland. So remember, you had Protestant Northern Ireland, still part of the UK, and then Catholic Irish Free State in the south, no longer part of the UK. So those conflicts with the IRA and was very much around him. They called it the Troubles. That was the technical term, the Troubles in Northern Ireland. A lot of the violence of the 20th century that was right around him his whole life. He grew up right near the border, actually, with the largely Catholic Irish Republic to the south. And so, he was right in the throes of it. He studied with other Northern Irish poets at Queen's University in Belfast. So you got Belfast in Northern Ireland, Dublin in Southern Ireland. Moved to and became a citizen of the Irish Republic in 1972. And he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1995. In 1972, when he moved to the South and to the Free State, there was the Bloody Sunday. Bloody Sunday, you probably heard that term, when 13 Catholic civilians were killed by British paratroopers during a march, so like a protest march. This is one of many examples of kind of the violent conflicts as Southern Ireland and the IRA fought to be united. He wrote all these bog poems that are about well-preserved corpses found in the peat of Northern Ireland. And so digging is an example, digging into the ground. But there's other bog poems. I can only include so much in these lessons, but if you look up some of his other bog poems, they actually find bodies, but the bodies are kind of like buried in the peat. Like, you get this whole idea of digging up the past and engaging with the past, which is such a part of modernism and such a part of kind of the Irish identity. Um, and Heaney uses these bodies and these bog poems as emblems to represent the violence of the Troubles. Again, the Troubles being the term people use to refer to the conflict between, Northern Ireland, Irish Free State, and Britain throughout the 20th century, as things were not really settled until some of the peace treaties in 1998. He translated Gaelic poetry and renewed specific Irish traditions, such as the Vision poem. So he wasn't as quite into the Celtic revival as Yeats, but he wasn't as much of a nationalist, but he was very much so into reviving Irish traditions and Irish poetries. He may be best known for completing a prize-winning translation of Beowulf, which shows his complicated relationship with the English language. His translation of Beowulf is so powerful and so beautiful. It won all kinds of awards and brought Beowulf into the public context. The movies that have been made as adaptations of Beowulf in the last 20 years would not be in existence if not for the attention Seamus Heaney's translation of Beowulf drew to the poem. But it's accurate, but he really takes a lot of liberties. It's not a very line by line translation. If you want to read a really line by line authentic translation, I'd read a different one. But it's absolutely beautiful. But he does take liberties with it. I actually wrote a paper on this in grad school that he basically makes Beowulf sound like Northern Ireland. And so Scandinavia, where Beowulf takes place, might have some similarities, but it looks more like Northern Ireland. And even the violence from Beowulf can kind of be, he kind of uses it for his own motives. It kind of compares to the Troublesome, the action scenes in Beowulf. So it's a fantastic read. It might not be the most authentic translation of Beowulf, but it's a fantastic read. All right, let's get to digging. Between my fingers and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean, rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father digging, I look down. These verses represent the idea of poetry as an archaeological process. Through the act of writing poetry, Heaney is figuratively digging into his past, where he uncovers his father and then grandfather, who both literally worked digging as laborers. So his father and his grandfather were blue-collar workers, and that's why the digging is important to Heaney. But like verses 1 and 2 or lines 1 and 2 tell us, between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. He's writing poetry. So his father and his grandfather were literally digging as workers. He's figuratively digging as a poet, and he's digging up the past. So memory and past are important in poetry, enables us to dig for them. And here you kind of get into national identity, because for Ireland they had this rich history with the Celtic and Gaelic literature. And I mentioned in the last lesson how Yeats really tried to revive those, and here Heaney is doing that some as well. And so digging up the past is important to Irish national identity, because they had their own rich literary history, well before the 20th century, when poets like Yeats and Joyce and Heaney emerged. Let's keep going here and look at some lines later in the poem. The cold smell of potato mold, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge, through living roots awaken in my head. But I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, I'll dig with it. So, poetry is a way to dig up the past. He's got the squat pen snug as a gun, digging. He's digging through his writing of poetry, and he uncovers his father and his grandfather. They were laborers. He is saying poetry is vocation, and that's so important. Like I said, as we start to see this breakdown between the breakdown of the wall between speaker and poet here pretty obviously. I wouldn't quite call this confessional poetry, but it's not far off. Um, but this is so clearly Heaney himself here, and we see that breakdown of that wall. It started with modernism, right? With Yeats, where Yeats has got to use beautiful language to describe the horrors of World War One, because the way the modernist grapples with the fragmented world is by creating beautiful poetry. And then with Rilke focusing on the poetic method, the thing poems, and actually having like a stated vision for what he intended to do with his poetry, you have meditation and reflection on the process of writing poetry as an integral part of modernism. Here, and kind of later on in postmodernism, you have the role of the poet themselves, himself or herself, is so very important. We'll see that even more in a minute. So important that in many of these poems we look at in this lesson, the poet is the speaker. So in modernism, the act of writing taking on a new, assertive, important role. Here in postmodernism, the role of the poet taking on a more active, assertive role. And that'll be even more important when we look at Derek Walcott in just a minute. But here with Heaney, we have his father is a digger. His grandfather is a digger. The vocation is important to all of us. Heaney, is a poet. And digging is important to him, too. But he's going to dig with his poetry. And that kind of gets at national identity, but it's a more personal poem. It gets at it through the importance of memory in the past. But if you look up and read more of his bog poems, those engage much more directly with Irish nationalism and with the Troubles. But this is a more personal poem and probably his most famous and best one. So I hope you enjoyed it too. For the second of the three poets we're going to look at today, Pablo Neruda, who is this incredible poet from South America, wrote some of the most beautiful love poems ever. He was the son of a railroad worker and school teacher, of Spanish and Indian ancestry, and then, according to the Norton Anthology of World Literature, in their introduction, the most important Latin American poet of the 20th century. So it's pretty clear why we would read him. His mother died a month after his birth, and his father remarried in Temuco, where Neruda had schooling. That was a frontier town, so you have kind of a similarity here. I don't know if Heaney's father approved of his exploits as a poet, but you have kind of that tension between like a blue-collar parent and then a poet. So his father did not approve of Neruda's literary pursuits. Gabriela Mistral, who was the principal of the Temuco Girls' School, became his mentor. And he won the Nobel Prize in 1945. Under her guidance, Neruda began publishing poetry at age 13. His name, Pablo Neruda, is kind of his pen name. So his given name, named after St. Paul, and then the surname of Czech writer Jan Neruda. He kind of created this. And he was appointed to the Nations Council to Burma, which was called Myanmar at the time, Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, and more. So he really had some time, around the world in different places. But during his lifetime, he witnessed the Spanish Civil War, and there's the shift you see later in his career. So his love poems are some of the most beautiful love poems ever written. People talk about them in TV shows. They're so beautiful. But he has a certain way of reflecting on the human experience that very much fits in with the themes of this lecture. But later in his life, as he became a war correspondent and became active politically, as we're seeing with our last bullet points here, he really started to focus more on war and became more of a public rather than a private poet. And it's really interesting to read some of his later poetry, which I don't like as much. It's good, but I like the love poems a lot. But to just kind of see how he does similar things thematically in both the love poems and the more political poems. So that's Pablo Neruda. Let's take a look at one of these love poems, one of the greatest ever written. Tonight I Can Write. Tonight I can write the saddest lines. Write, for example, the night is shattered and the blue stars shiver in the distance. The night wind revolves in the sky and sings. Tonight I can write the saddest lines. I loved her, and sometimes she loved me too. The experience of the night gives the speaker the ability to write about his lost love. As the night moves, it shatters, it shivers, it revolves, it moves him to write. I don't know if you'd quite call that personification, because the night does do that, but it's sort of like personification where the night is really doing something here, and it gives him the ability to write. We shouldn't overlook the title. Tonight I can write. That's really important, and we'll come back to it. Continuing along here. Through nights like this one, I held her in my arms. I kissed her again and again under the endless sky. She loved me sometimes, and I loved her too. How could one not have loved her great, still eyes? Tonight I can write the saddest lines. To think that I do not have her, to feel that I have lost her. To hear the immense night, still more immense without her, and the verse falls to the soul like dew to the pasture. Here we have this powerful description that his love was like almost beyond his control. How could one not have loved her great still eyes? The lost love and the night continue to intermingle. Lost love makes the night more immense. So there's something about this evening, how it reminds him of his nights with her. He's finally able to get to the point where he can write about the relationship. What does it matter that my love could not keep her? The night is shattered and she is not with me. This is all. In the distance, someone is singing. In the distance. My soul is not satisfied that it has lost her. My sight tries to find her as though to bring her closer. My heart looks for her, and she is not with me. The same night whitening the same trees. We of that time are no longer the same. I no longer love her, that's certain, but how I loved her. My voice tried to find the wind to touch her hearing. So just really cool how he uses the night as a way to like communicate, and he no longer loves her, but he still laments the loss because it was such a great love. So that's important. It's interesting because you've got so many poems about unrequited love and so many poems about lost love and breakups, but it's usually I would say, or often from the position of a speaker who is still really in the thralls of the love. And this feels like it's a long time in the past. And she loved him sometimes, and he really loved her, but he no longer does. So he has been able to kind of have the ability to move forward some, but the writing is very important to that. Again, there's this connection because the night is similar to the nights they shared together. He's kind of trying to reach her through that, which is just a really cool part of the poem. Another's. She will be another's, as she was before my kisses. Her voice, her bright body, her infinite eyes. Speaker's love. So I'm kind of intruding here to give commentary, I should say that. The speaker of the poem, his love is part of a larger existence. She had other lovers before him, and she has other lovers after him. That's important. I no longer love her, that's certain, but maybe I love her. Love is so short, forgetting is so long. Because through nights like this one, I held her in my arms. My soul is not satisfied that it has lost her. So repetition. This poem has a lot of repetition. It's kind of broken up on the PowerPoint. If you have it all laid out in front of you, either on the screen or if you printed it out, you can see how repetition is really important in this poem. So this line, my soul is not satisfied that it has lost her, is very important. But he also repeats just above that, I no longer love her. That's certain, but maybe I love her. I love that juxtaposition of that's certain, but maybe I love her. So you can really probably all of us have been in a relationship at some point. This is a very relatable, accessible poem, right? We can really know this feeling of like you've moved on. I loved her. I don't really feel that way now, but maybe I do. And it really rings home when he says love is so short, forgetting is so long. And that's the difference. Maybe he'll never forget her. Though this be the last pain that she makes me suffer, and these are the last verses that I write for her. And there's the end. So you really have the interiority, the evolution of the speaker's thoughts. His thoughts evolve over time. He doesn't say that he no longer loves her until about 3/4 of the way through the poem. And then even here at the end, he still has these, I would say, like nostalgic feelings for their love. He's still mourning the loss of their love, even if he doesn't love her with the passionate intensity that he once did. So we see an evolution here over the course of the poem. Tonight I can write. He has to write this poem to get to the conclusion he reaches here. So my kind of summative thought is the act of writing provides catharsis, which I've mentioned throughout this class, or purgation of emotions. It's a Greek word that means the purging of emotions, but it means so much more than that the emotions are just gone. It's like we have these emotions roiling around within us, and then we have some kind of experience that releases them, and that's really important for human existence. So much so the Greeks wrote plays to kind of cause it to happen, like Oedipus, which is a whole thing I could talk about in another class on narrative theory. But here we get the idea that he has to work through this. He has to not just purge his emotions, but have the experience of writing this poem to get to the point he gets at here. And so writing is one of the most cathartic ways, or best ways, to mend a wounded heart. And so it's a very personal poem where we really hear his thoughts, and in that way it really connects with the other poems in this lesson. Haney's poem was personal too. All these poems are personal, but there's a way they engage with the social consciousness at the same time. And then, like I said, Neruda later in his life was a much more political poet, but employed a lot of the same strategies. So if you go on and read more of his poems, I'd be curious to hear what you think at some point. I didn't assign them for the class, but if we ever have the chance to hear what you think of how this kind of a writer then went on to write more outward focused things. But just what a beautiful poem. And the other one I included, some of the most beautiful love poems ever. Okay, so here's our last poet. I'm getting sad because we're coming to the end. Derek Walcott, one of the most brilliant poets ever, as we'll see here in a second. He was born on the island of St. Lucia in the British West Indies. It was a largely Roman Catholic society, and a former both British and French colony. It was actually colonized by both the British and the French at different points, and they fought over it for years. That's really important. He went to the University of West Indies in Jamaica, then Trinidad, and worked as a book reviewer, art critic, and playwright. From the early 80s on, he taught at U.S. colleges, primarily Boston University, and won the Nobel Prize in 1992, 2 years after he wrote his poem Amoros, which I'll talk more about in a minute. He said he had split allegiances to African, Caribbean, and European heritages. So these are words he used to describe himself: a schizophrenic, a mongrel, and a mulatto of style. He borrows so much from Irish writers like Joyce and Yeats. And similarly, his experience, kind of like the Irish experience, is so emblematic of the modern and then postmodern condition, because his island was colonized by both the British and the French. The French were the first to colonize it, and they actually completely committed genocide, wiped out the indigenous inhabitants of St. Lucia, and brought African slaves from the slave trade there. So you have people, who are the majority of the people who grew up on the island, who seem like they would be natives, but they're not actually natives. The natives were wiped out, and they were brought there as part of the slave trade. And then you've got colonization on top of it, because the British and the French continually fought over this island. And then so he grows up on this island with that background is kind of like his heritage, you could say, passed down to him. And he but then he goes and he gets educated. He teaches in the U.S. and England, and then he writes in English. So it's just such a mix and such a complicated history. He had grandmothers of African descent, but his grandfathers were Dutchmen and Englishmen. St. Lucia traded hands 14 times, like I just said, in colonial wars between the British and the French. The official language was English Standard, but then in everyday use on the island they had French Creole patois, and he spoke both, because again, at different points. And Salman Rushdie, another post-colonial writer, talks about the paradoxical hatred of the British Empire and a simultaneous love of the English language. And so that kind of sums it up. I should have put bullet points on here, but what I wanted to say is in 1990, Walcott published a poem called Amoros. And Amoros is a French Creole patois rendering of the name Homer. And it's in some ways yet another retelling of the Odyssey, but it's an epic poem. It's very long. If you buy it go to Barnes & Noble or somewhere and buy it and hold it in your hand, it's about the size of a novel, but it's all poetry. So it's probably the most recent example I can think of a truly epic poem. And actually, when I've taught this class in person on the 10-week quarter, I've actually assigned it and we've read it the last few weeks of class. We're only getting a sampling of that, what he's able to do with that in this short poem called Map of the New World here. But it's really incredible what he does. He tells a story on this island of St. Lucia. He himself is a character in the poem. So that fits with the themes we've been talking about this lesson, but he's not the main character. All the characters have names that are renderings of like different renderings of names from Greek mythology. So you have two characters named Achilles, which is a rendering of Achilles, and then Hector, and then a woman named Helen. And in the poem, there's a love triangle between Achilles and Hector fighting over Helen, and so that kind of represents the British and the French fighting over the island. But there's so much more to it. There's so many allusions and references. You can download footnotes to it. It's just, if there's any, I've recommended a lot of reading we weren't able to get to in this class. The Duno Elegies and Sonnets to Orpheus by Rainer Maria Rilke would be one of my top recommends, but Amoros by Derek Walcott, top recommend. We just didn't have time for the whole book for obvious reasons. So let's read Map of the New World. At the end of this sentence, rain will begin. At the rain's edge, a sail. Slowly the sail will lose sight of islands. Into a mist will go the belief in harbors of an entire race. The 10 years' war is finished. Helen's hair, a gray cloud. Troy, a white ash pit by the drizzling sea. The drizzle tightens like the strings of a harp. A man with clouded eyes picks up the rein and plucks the first line of the Odyssey. So in this short 12-line poem, very short poem, so much is happening. It's so much. He's playing with language and allusions here to make his point. And so let's start with just the title. The Map of the New World, right? There's a double meaning here. A question that is one of the most important questions posed by Walcott and all post-colonial writers is what is next? Colonialism has ended, not throughout the whole world, but in particular countries like this one. And what do you do now? You can't go back. There's no going back before. So Salman Rushdie, Derek Walcott, other post-colonial writers will often use the fall in Genesis 3 from a Christian worldview just as an example to say there's no going back to before this, and to just kind of try to show the catastrophic horror of colonialization. So what do you do? How do you march forth? And so the phrase New World is a phrase that imperialists often use to describe the parts of the world they colonized. The irony was that most of those parts of the world were actually older. People had lived there longer than in Europe. so he's playing on kind of critiquing, subverting that illusion, but that you have to create a new world beyond the colonial world. In a post-colonial life, you have to create a new world, and so that's what Walcott tries to do with his poetry, powerfully. And so we just get glimpses here of how he tries to create that new world, but he plays with these illusions, right? And so he grew up on an island that people fought over, and Troy was the city, right, surrounded by water. That's why the Greeks had to launch 1,000 ships and then try to fight their way there to land. And he uses the most famous epic poem, the Odyssey, as a way, and retells it in a very different way to create his own epic for his own people. And that act right there kind of sums up, what he's trying to do is he grapples with the post-colonial experience, where you take something old, you rework it and make it new, right? Because they can't go back to before colonization. So you kind of rework the past and try to create a present, try to create a future, knowing you can never go back to some kind of Edenic world, before the horror of colonization. And so he does that here by playing on these literary illusions. You can just envision it. You can just see it here with his language. The 10 Years' War is finished, so the Trojan War is over. Helen's hair, a gray cloud. So she's either old or it's gone. Troy, a white ash pit. So Troy has been, leveled by the Greeks. There's another famous poem, the Aeneid, which is a Roman poem that's about one of the survivors of Troy after the Trojan War. And it's a great poem too, but the first verses of it, the first book or two, is him escaping as Troy is just being destroyed by the Greeks. And so having read that poem, it kind of helps me see Troy as a white ash pit here. The drizzle tightens like the strings of a harp. A man with clouded eyes picks up the rain. Some great kind of like personification, I don't know what the term is, thing happening there. And plucks the first line of the Odyssey. So there's, Troy is destroyed, but there's rebirth, there's creation after that, because the Odyssey, right, is what happens after Troy. So what happens after colonization? A map of the new world. So we really see the moves here of what we studied in lessons 6 and 7, from modernism to postmodernism to postcolonialism. The act of writing poetry gives the author the opportunity to create something new. So, like I said, in modernism, the act of writing poetry and reflecting on the methodology was so important to how the modernist writers grappled with modernity. And then for postmodernists, even more so, the poet himself or herself themselves having that role, right? That's important. The speaker becomes the poet, like we saw in Seamus Heaney's Digging, and in the confessional poetry especially. And so you have that. So the poet can create something new. The poet can give birth. So in Omeros, the long epic poem by Derek Walcott, which this poem, Map of the New World, is like a little Omeros. We see the kind of allusions he's making here and the playing with language. He does that in Omeros all the way through to tell a narrative. And in that narrative, like I said, you have these two characters, they're natives of St. Lucia, or, that's complicated, but anyway, you get what I'm saying. But one is named Achille and one is named Hector, because he's borrowing the language from the myths, and they're fighting over Helen. They're both in love with her. They both dated her. They're fighting over her. At the end of it, she's pregnant. She's giving birth, but she doesn't know if the baby is Hector's or Achille's. And that is so important because it's the hybridity, the mixing of cultures. We can't go back to the way life was before. If she knew who the father was, that would be more like returning to the old life, but the new life is born out of a combining of cultures. But it's a new life. She's having a baby. So you have to create new. You have to forge ahead. But the new can't just be repetition of the old. It's a combination of the old, the new, and the mixing of everything that happened. So that's how Walcott has like this poetic vision for the response to colonialism and living the new life. Again, it's this very kind of high brow kind of approach to literature because you have to understand all the allusions and references, so I can see problems with that. But through the literature, he's trying to create kind of a new vision for the world where the past and the present are married or intermixing, so to speak, but new life is being created at the same time. Thus, Walcott uses classical literary references in a new poem he has created to enflesh the idea of new hybrid life and demonstrate the healing process of writing. So here we are at the end. To sum up this lesson, I would say you see the breakdown of the wall between poet and speaker in our most recent examples of poetry. That places a newer, more emphatic emphasis on the role of the poet in the creative process. And you see the horrors of life, the 20th, the 21st century, there was so much war, genocide, like the 20th century had to be one of the worst centuries in human existence. But out of that comes some of the most beautiful poetry ever written. And so what we see is the process of writing is healing. And through a breakdown between speaker and poet, we're able to get kind of an insight into the mind of the writer and how these writers use the act of writing poetry as a healing process for themselves personally. But then, like with Walcott, you can see how the personal transcends, and he's able to do something that's very personal to him, like Plath, like Heaney, like Neruda, but then it transcends and it also takes on a national perspective at the same time, and he hopes will then provide healing for his people, his island, his country. So hopefully that all comes through. I think it's just really a great way to end the class because this world is fallen and broken. Life is not easy, but through poems like Atlantis, through poems like Map of the New World, we're really able to see what writing can do, what poetry can do in response to the horrors of the world, and help point us towards salvation, help point us toward new life, new creation, rebirth, rising to something better and greater than ourselves and greater than this world that transcends it. So I hope you've enjoyed the poetry in the class as much as I have. Even just from reading your discussion board posts so far through just 2 lessons, like I said, if you have even a fraction of the amount of fun I have had, you'll really enjoy this class. And I hope you do. And go out, and after it's over, with your free time, read some more poetry. Read Omeros by Derek Walcott. Read the Duno Elegies by Rainer Maria Rilke. Read some great poetry. Take care.